Working with data, especially arrays and objects, is a confusing issue, especially for the beginners. However, it's a fundamental in JavaScript. Additionally, it is frequently brought up whenever you are interviewing for a front-end development job. So today we're going to cover everything that we should know whenever we are preparing for this kind of interview, or basically whenever we are working with any kind of arrays or objects, just to understand how they work and how we can operate on them. Now, with copying arrays and objects, things get a little tricky, and plenty of recruiters would like to hear what you know about those things. Now, the most common way to create a shallow copy is to use a spread operator. So those three dots that basically mean that the new users is an array with a content that is shallow copied from users array. So spread operator allows us to create a shallow copy of array or object, because we can do the same with three dots inside of the object. But however, we are not doing this right now. Now, shallow copying is tricky because new users, even though it's a new variable, shares the same reference to the same instance of JavaScript memory. So now, if I were to change the new user's address street, so Kyle's address street to new street, and then console log the original array, and also check the street of Kyle, it is now the new street that was created and updated inside our new variable. So now, because new users share the same reference of the same instance in the JavaScript memory, if we now manipulate any of the properties of those objects inside our new array, we are also updating the original array as well. So now, to make sure that whenever we update new users, and we do not update the original array, we could do a deep copy. And there's an old school way of doing that and a new school way of doing that. And I prefer the new school, and I believe it should be preferred, because the old school way is to basically create a deep clone with JSON parse and inside of that JSON stringify of users. However, now it is preferred to do a deep clone with something that is native to JavaScript and is called structured clone of users. And now if I were to once again do something like this, so let's do a deep clone of address street of new where street, and then compare it to the original one. Let's maybe console log that out first. So console log users address street. Now it's called new street. So it is still being referred to this initial change. However, now it is not updated by our deep clone. So what's important is that this specific deep clone has created a new piece of instance in our JavaScript memory and holds no reference to the original array whatsoever. Now, also, that is why it is really important for array and object, because it is not happening for primitive values in JavaScript like strings, booleans, and numbers. Because if I were to create a variable called a, which is equal to 5, and then also create a variable b that's equal to a, so so b should also be equal to 5, and then I decide to change b into 6, then it doesn't affect a whatsoever. As you can see, even though b is equal to 6, now b, even though it became equal to a, it still doesn't have any kind of reference to a, and it has its own place in JavaScript memory. So now a is still 5, and the same happens for strings and booleans. Also, whenever you are interviewing for a front-end development job, you typically have a few small exercises where you are asked to manipulate and do some things with the objects and the arrays that you were given. So, for example, you may be asked to use those users array and create an array out of that with names only. So in order to create that, we can create a new variable called names, which will be created by running a map method on the original array that basically takes a callback function that iterates through every single element of the array, and it returns the item that is somehow manipulated or mutated. In our case, we'll be basically returning the item.name. And as you can see now, if we console log names, it is Kyle and Alina. So this is how we do it. Also, we can do it with a one-liner. So instead of doing function and return and everything, we can do an array function that basically gets the item, and with an array it returns item.name. And the same thing happens. So that's how we use the map method. And also it is important that .map, as well as any other similar method like filter, reduce, join, return a shallow copy of the array. So this is also one of the methods that we could use to create a shallow copy of an array or object. So now let's go through a few typical questions or exercises you might get on your front-end interview. So first of all, the most basic one is, what is the difference between map and forEach? So now we know that .map basically returns a new array, which is basically a shallow copy of the original array with some mutated data. But now the difference between map and forEach is that forEach doesn't do the first thing that we discussed. So it doesn't return a new piece of variable, but it basically mutates the original array only. So we could also create a names array, but with forEach, you would have to first create a new names array, which will be empty first, and then it would basically go with users for each. That would also take a callback function with user, and then every single time it iterates for every single user object, it would push the name into our names array. So names array dot push user dot name. So now if we were to console log the names array, it's now Carl and Alina. So this is the main difference between map and forEach. So let's stick with that. The second question is, return the users with age 27 or higher. So in our case, it should only be Kyle. And in order to do that, we can once again run a shallow copy method. So we can do users with age higher than 27. And it would be users now dot filter. And once again, this method accepts a callback function that takes a user. And now we would like to filter out a user that has an age of 27 and higher. So now if we console log this one, we have only Kyle, as you can see, nothing else. Now, if we were asked to give the names of those users only, we could basically add .map and do once again user.name. And now if I was to console log this out, we have Kyle. So that's awesome. Now something a little bit trickier. Now we could run sum the user's age. So let's create an age variable that basically is equal to users reduce. And now our reduce method takes a callback, which now takes two specific arguments. The first argument of our callback is called accumulator. We can call it however I want, but for now, let's stick to accumulator. And the other one is current value. And as the second argument after our function, we need to create an initial value for our accumulators. So because the age should be an integer, we should name it to 0. And now accumulator means that this 0 is now the point of our source. And now this method iterates through the array and takes the current value and does whatever we want with our accumulator using the current value properties. So if we have an accumulator equal to 0 for the first time, and we iterate for the first item, we would like to have accumulator added up with the current value dot age. And it will do the same for the upcoming iterated items. So now if we were to console log the age, oh, sorry, I missed the return statement. So now if we have the 54, it means that we added up the current value dot age of Kyle, and then so the accumulator for the first item had 28, and then it went through the second item, and to the accumulator equal to 28, it once again used the current value, which was Alina, and used its age. So now it's 54. Now, the question 4 is add a new user as the second element in the array without modifying the content of the array. So basically, we need to add a new user between Kyle and Alina without modifying the rest. So the sequence of those users should stay the same. Now, what we could do is basically create a user at the index of 1, which is the second user. And let's say its name should be new. But now, if we do so and we console log the users, you can see that once we hover on this, we are replacing the second element with the content of our new. So we have no Alina in the array. Now there's a neat way to actually either remove, replace, or add new elements in a specific place by using the splice method. So we can run this method on our users directly. And the splice method has a lot of tools built into it depending on what kind of arguments you pass in. So for example, if we, let's say, would like to replace the second position, so our Alina to something different, what we could do is that we can go with the start number, which in our case, Alina is on index 1. Then we would like to tell how many elements to either remove or replace. So in our case, it should be 1. And we could go, let's say, name new. And now if I console log users and I hover on this, you can see that now Alina has been changed to new. But now we would like to keep Alina. So in order to do that, we should tell our splice method that, yes, we should start with the second argument, so with index number 1. But when we pass a 0 as the second argument, it tells us that it should basically insert that into the start index. So now, as you can see, we have Kyle, new, Alina, Chris, Dorothy. So that's how we can use splice. And as you can see also, splice is not directly allowing us to create a new variable. It mutates the original array. However, from ECMAScript 2023, we actually have a new method that is really similar to this one, but the only difference is that it allows us to create a new variable, a new shallow copy of this mutated array that is called toSpliced. So I can create a variable called spliced and do users toSpliced, and then once again repeat the thing. So 1, 0, name, new. And now, if I console log not users, but spliced, you can see that we have the same thing. Or actually, we have two news because we have already modified this piece. So if I delete that, we have the correct thing, console logged out. Speaking of the devil, the splice method can be really confused with a slice method. And this is also quite a common question on our interviews. So what is the difference between slice and splice method? So first of all, we know that the slice method allows us to either remove, replace, or insert a new element to the array, and it doesn't allow us to create a new variable, a new shallow copy out of that. However, we can use toSpliced to do so similarly. However, there is a difference between splice and slice method, because slice actually works in a similar fashion to toSpliced because it automatically returns a shallow copy, but of a portion of the array. So if we do sliced, and as you can think, slice means cutting something. So we are not able to do some kind of mutation. We are not allowed to insert something. We can only use it for creating a new copy with reduced number of elements. So if we do users.slice, and let's say that I would only like to have the last two pieces of the array, then what I can do is I can go backwards from the end of the array with -2, and it allows me to get the last two pieces of the array. So apart from doing that, we can also basically go in a normal fashion. So we can basically say that I would like to get the third and the fourth piece of our array. So I can do slice from the index number 2, so the third element, and also I would like to get the fourth element. So it has an index 3, but the end should be 4 because I would also like to get the third one. So if I now console log sliced once again, oops. As you can see, we are having Chris and Dorothy, so the last two pieces, so number 3 and number 4. So index number 2 and index number 3. So if we had an element with index number 4, we shouldn't be getting it. So instead, we should be doing 2 to 5 and so forth. So please keep in mind that we have slice, splice, and toSpliced, and those are 3 different ways of interacting and creating shallow copies of arrays. So slice allows us to actually return a new shallow copy of an array by reducing and slicing specific content of the array. Splice only works at the source array, and it doesn't allow us to return a shallow copy, but only mutates the original one. And not only does it allow us to remove, but also replace and insert some new things. And additionally, we can use something newer called toSpliced, and it allows us to do the same thing as splice, but with the allowance to create a shallow copy of an array and assigning it to a variable. Now, a slightly more advanced exercise that I once got during an interview. I basically received an array of objects that were representing a list of messages coming from different senders with different texts and with different timestamps. Now, the exercise here is to first of all sort all of those messages by their date, so coming from the newest ones to the oldest ones, and additionally search and output the specific message by a specific query. So for example, if we were creating a chat application that has a search bar that we can search through a specific piece of text, that is what you would typically do inside the application itself. So we have messages array with objects that have an ID, sender, text, and timestamp, which is in our favor in a pretty nice format. So let's create sorted array that will take in messages, so a shallow copy of messages. And here we introduce another method that also returns a shallow copy of an array and allows us to iterate through the array that compares the previous value to a next value. So sort takes in a callback that takes two arguments, the previous value and the next value that is coming after that. So it takes the first and the second argument, and it allows us to compare them and sort them in a way that is, for example, based on the date. So if we compare the date by the timestamp and reduce it by the date that is coming next, we are sorting them by the latest date. Additionally, if we create a new one called filtered, now we can do sorted. And also we can now once again run a filter that we already have gotten to know. And we can basically take the message object and we can try to find message.text, additionally to lowercase, just to make sure that every single query that we are running is case insensitive. And we can check whether this text includes our query. Now let's, for example, use AWS. So most likely it will find this awesome piece. Now, if we console log filtered, we have an array with an object that only contains awesome. Now, we will not see the sorted here, but if we have sorted, for example, here, as we see, we have, first of all, the 930, 932, 935, and 10, and then 1005, and also the IDs are now in order. Now, a little bit even more advanced exercise here. Make sure that the new array doesn't contain objects that have duplicate names. So as you can see, we have a list of duplicate users, meaning that some of those have the same name. So we have 2 Alices, 2 Bobs, and 1 Charlie. Now, the idea is to get rid of any objects that are duplicates. So if we just iterate one by one, I don't want to have the second Bob. I don't want to have the second Alice. I only want the first one to be selected and be inside my new array. So for example, if the user already exists, I don't want this to happen, even if we have the duplication inside of our array. Now, in order to complete this task, what we could do is we could create a map. Now, a map is basically a collection of key value pairs, so the same way as objects are created. So that way, whenever we run an iteration on the duplicate users, we can create a collection where the first element of the map will be set to user.profile.name, and the value for this key will be the entire user. So that way, if we now console log our map, you see now that we have Alice, Bob, and Charlie. And what's important is that, let's say that the iterator just went through the first piece. It created a collection that key was Alice and the content was the rest of the content of the user. Whenever it iterated and saw that it would like to create a new Alice key value pair, it overwrote the first Alice. So that's why we got the Alice with the ID 3 and not ID 1. And the same with Bob, that was all ID. Now, because this is a map that has a key of Alice and the value of the actual user, we would only want to have the content without those keys. So what we could do is we could create, let's say, new users, no duplicates, and let's create an array from the map or dot values. And this is actually awesome about the map object because it has some really nice built-in methods like set, like values, like entries that allow us to more performantly and more cleanly work with those. So now if we console log the new users, no duplicates, we actually see that we have an array of users that are not duplicated. So this is actually awesome. Now, a similar object structure to map is also called set. Now, set is used for similar reasons to map, but for more primitive things like strings, numbers, and booleans. So if we have an array that only contains primitive values like numbers and strings in here, and we have 4s that are duplicates, 5s that are duplicates, and Charlies that are duplicates, what we could do is we could actually create a, let's say, non-duplicate R variable. And if we iterate through a set that has a content of our array, now if we console log that out, you see that now we only have an array that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and Charlie and Bob. So it basically got rid of anything. So this is a really nice trick if you are working with primitive values inside of your array and you just want to get rid of any pieces of data that are duplicate. Now, there are so many other methods on arrays that you can actually use, like find index of, last index of, pop, push, and everything around it. But those were the ones that I believe are the most crucial ones when it comes to working with advanced pieces of data. Plus, they are also frequently run and asked about when you are interviewing for a front-end development job. Now, for the objects, the same rules apply when it comes to shallow and deep copying. So whenever you would like to create a shallow copy of an object, just do spread operator and it will create a shallow copy of the object, but with the curly brackets around it. Or you can work with structured clone, but with the object, it will work the same. When it comes to looping, we don't have things like forEach or .map or any other things because those are not arrays. But let's say that we have an object called users by ID. Now, the most primitive and the most basic way to loop for this object would be to use for in loop. So for const key in users by ID, let's console log what key is. As you can see, it basically gets all the keys of the object itself. And what we could also check is the values, and we could do that by going users by ID key. And as you can see now, we have list of, well, console log of all of the values, but with no keys before them. Similarly, what we could do is we can run an Object.keys, for example, and let's console log that out as well, just to see the content of this method. And as you can see, the Object.keys returns an array of keys, which is also quite good for the further development. The same way, we can also do Object.values. And as you can see, this is an array of objects that only are represented by values. And the same we can do with .entries. And as you can see now, this is an array of arrays that have a key. And then after the comma, it has the value. This is actually not the easiest one to follow. However, all of those object keys, object entries, and object.values, because they return array, they allow us to work with .map, with .forEach, and .everything that we would like to work with arrays. So it basically comes down to whenever you have a large object of object, make sure that you are able to convert it to an array of objects, because if you have an array of objects, this is most likely easier to manipulate than work with objects of objects. So now we have an exercise that basically tells us to return names of the users that only have admin role. So as you can see, we have one user that has an admin role here and the fourth one at the bottom. Now, the goal is to create an array that only has the name of Alice and Dana. So what I would do is I could create a new variable called new users and run Object.values on users by ID. And now if I console log new users, Let's actually rename it to R users, because otherwise we will have a duplicate variable coming from above. And now if we console log that out, we see that the R users is basically the object, the array of objects with those values. Now we can do, maybe let's write a result variable, and now R users dot filter with a callback that takes user and filters out any user that has a role of admin, and then it only maps the user's name, so dot name. And now if I console log the result, we have Alice and Dana. So that was the way. So basically everything comes down to recreating the object as an array, and we can run any kind of array methods on those objects. Another exercise, because as we discussed earlier, we know what kind of methods we could use on arrays to delete, insert, or replace specific things. In our case, this is the exercise where we are asked to delete the Dana user, so basically the user 4. And what you could actually do is pretty simple. What you could do is you could write delete and then users by ID and user 4. And now if I console log users by ID, we can now see that we do not have the user 4 inside of our object. So this is kind of cool and quite straightforward. So that was mostly everything that I believe you should know as a beginner or intermediate JavaScript dev. Whenever you are trying to figure out how to manipulate your data with arrays or objects, there are much more stuff that we could learn on. But this is, I think, crucial, and it is a very good point of entry whenever you are practicing your data manipulation. So go over and get your hands dirty on whatever you are working on, and hopefully those things will matter to you. If you enjoyed the video, I'll be grateful for your thumbs up or your subscription, because that motivates me to create more of those. So stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next one.